Hello, everyone, and welcome to Year 2 of Ventures. Year 2 is essentially Season 2, where this time I'll be mixing in more shorter episodes that explain one particular topic that we may have discussed at length in different parts of previous episodes. So what I'm going to do is mix in my own commentary on top of previous clips that I hope will be helpful for you to better wrap your head around the different topics that we talk about on this show. So for today, we're going to be talking about Web 3.0. What is Web 3.0? What are blockchains? Why does this matter? I'm going to mix in a few clips from previous episodes. Check out the show notes for more details there. And if you're watching this show, you can also listen anywhere that you get your podcasts. You can just search for Ventures. And if you're listening, you can also visit wclittle.com to watch the episode, and there you'll see more extensive show notes and links to articles that I appreciate about Web 3.0. Thanks. Something you said, I think, that rung some serious bells in my head here on a number of different topics. But for one in particular that you mentioned, is that why the internet was originally designed, right? Around this concept of nuclear weapons. And I'm old enough to remember the feeling of
Cold War.
Feeling of war, like we're going to get attacked, right? I grew up in the Bremerton, Washington area, just outside of Seattle, all right, and the naval base. My dad worked for the Navy, and I was right in between a submarine base, a shipyard, right, a big Navy town, and I remember thinking, like, if we're going to get attacked, the missile's going to come right on my house. Right? So I remember that emotion, but I think it's important to call out because Web 1.0, right, the original web, was this beautiful decentralized set of protocols that people rallied around to try to bring a force for good, to bring sort of power to the people, so to speak, and share information. It was this sort of beautiful utopian vision. And I think I share some of the concern, some of the serious concern about where Web 2.0 went. With a massive amount of centralization of data that when it was economically driven, it resulted in a relatively few number of companies controlling kind of the whole internet. And so what I think you're hinting at in the things that are going off is that now in the Web 3 world, we seem to be
decentralized again.
Right. We seem to be swinging back to an era of decentralized protocols, self-sovereign identities, services that are all around the world that could literally survive those types of attacks. And I'm curious from your perspective, how you're thinking about this, given the trajectory of your career. Are the Web3 things, are we all just kind of another generation of utopians, or are we onto something here? Is Web3 going to be a thing?
You know, I like a lot of I think a lot of the ideas are very powerful now, and I was part of that generation, right? We're all going to, information is going to be free and easy to get to, and we're all going to be smarter and make better decisions. Of course, we went completely the opposite direction, and I'm a little bit older than you. Well, I mean, for us, you guys are probably not quite old enough to remember duck and cover drills. When I was in elementary school, we had regular drills, right, where you would literally duck and cover under your desks or go out in the hallway. The assumption was if an atomic bomb landed in the schoolyard, we were going to have to protect ourselves. That was that was just life. It wasn't just because we were a military family. It was that was just part of the deal here. But this idea of this, and I think that's a fair perspective to think about this sort of decentralized of the infrastructure, right? And the exciting thing for me, and I was really in-house NSA guy. 92 to 94, I wound up on loan out to Sandia National Labs, the nuclear weapons engineering lab. So I got to see a different part of the world. When I came back, though, the web was starting to take off, and I had a couple of really amazing people that worked in my group. And the first one sits me down. I never, again, NSA. Hey, there might be an internet terminal, as we called it, per 100 people, located in the corner someplace, right? Only a certain cast of characters got to use it for whatever reason. But he sat me down, kind of showed me the early days of what was going on. We're wandering through I think it was a university library in Germany, right? Looking at sort of original source texts and stuff. I'm going, oh my God, the world is different. This is amazing. And that sort of excitement of where this was going to go, right? That you could go to kind of where information was. And that information, I think some of the things I think would make sense to me in a Web 3.0 is, and this is a sharing thing, right? when I've talked about sharing things from a government perspective, what a lot of people in government meant was everybody send me all you got, right? Everybody share with me, and I will become the convener, organizer, miner, and then you guys, I'll dole out information to you guys. And those never work. Those never worked in my everybody send me your cyber incidents, and then we'll share them back out. And it never worked because people have 50 reasons why they won't share. Legal, right. Classification, blah, blah, blah. I said, the only way you can make those work is if you keep control. What information creators don't want is to give up control, right? For all kinds of reasons, classification, again, liability, et cetera. And so the more we can sort of decentralize in the sense of keeping information under the control of the creator, the more sharing you will get. And I think that's just intuitive to me in the way I've thought about these sort of modern ways that the web could work. Because this idea of aggregation, through intermediaries, whether they're search or whatever, comes with so many social perils, as we're seeing play out in the press today.
I was going to add one thing, or ask one thing for you. Your just sort of thoughts on this sort of subtopic of that Web 3.0 world. I think self-sovereign identity is probably one that's interesting because we're giving the human the responsibility and the accountability of creating their identity, but then being good stewards of their own recovery, leveraging trusted platforms to use those identities. That's one to me is very interesting because it opens up so many new use cases for peer-to-peer or peer to conglomerate or conglomerate to conglomerate or co-op to co-op, right? There's so many ways to think about relationships when individuals become what they really are, individuals digitally, right? And they trust the system. I'm curious about what you were just saying on that. Not only if that happens, that's cool, that's utopia, that's a good step in the right direction, but what about weeding out or culling out the negative of the system, right? I like positive reinforcements where we have anti-corruption. So if you behave badly, you get kicked out of the system. The system doesn't like you. We only reinforce good behavior. That's utopian brain on, right? Thinking that part, but is that something that's part of your game when you think of, defense, offense? Like in Web 3.0, it's so complex. You could do some really good positive and you can do some significant negative with the right tweak in the right spot. And that's the part that I'm most concerned with, right? Does that make any sense, that question? Because that's the world that I now look through the lens of in this Web 3.0 world.
I think the thing that we have to sort out, as a society to empower that, Asal. So I'm going to simplify that because that's what I do, right? That everything we do in our life, right, as social creatures involves some risk. There's sort of I call it just three bins. There's stuff you got to do, right? It's built in, it's law, regulation, etc. There's stuff that the market can enforce or not enforce, based upon preferences, right? So, and then there's your individual behavior, the choices that you make. And again, in a sort of classical national defense that I talked about before, the government really dominates that, right? The government does this. You don't get a vote in what the army looks like. You pay your taxes, and it's relatively straightforward. That's not acceptable for the world that we're in today. It's a much more complicated, distributed world. Yet there is still a role for government to sort of establish basic foundational principles, right? They get built into regulation, built into God. And so the only question is sort of how we negotiate what that boundary should look like. But I think as of now, government hasn't figured that part out yet, right? It's people are struggling with it, and I say this with respect. Some of the most noble, smart people I've ever met in my life, or I knew in government service, or they're still there, but there's not that many of them, and there are not enough of them to really understand what these implications are. So there's the sorting of that out, and it's very politically fragile. And that second bin of what can the market encourage or discourage. And and that's been the mantra for not just this prior administration, but the one before and the one before. Let the market tell us what the winners and the losers are. That's not very acceptable either, frankly, because consumers have no way to make a decent choice. Right? There's no notion of what constitutes good or bad. It's too complicated. And so I think building mechanisms that allow people not to make perfect choices, but better choices with some knowledge, which means things like credentialing, badging, conformance with some sort of frameworks or whatever the right term would be, that would allow people to make more knowing choices about that. And then there's, and again, all our lives are dominated by those kinds of things, right? You have things that are locked into building codes. You can affect the price you pay for homeowners insurance, depending on how far away I live in the rural areas. How far away I am from the firehouse determines my insurance rates. I have a little bit of flexibility to manipulate that choice in there, but I know what the options are. And then the third is my individual behavior. Right? So I'm a grandfather now. I got 2 granddaughters. I would never let my granddaughters ride in a car with a family that doesn't enforce seatbelt laws. Right? Independent of what the law is, I just wouldn't. So by my choice, the way I shun people or accept their behavior or negate their behavior and so what really needs to dominate is the middle one in this. The consumers need much better ways to make choices, right? And I do a lot of local work here in retirement with the Lions Club and church groups, trying to help, because that's my sounding board, right? Like normal people. Normal people will never become cyber experts. Most of our economy will never hire a cybersecurity expert, right, to work on their staff. So they need much simpler ways to make decent choices about these kinds of things. And so that, how do we then, so my concern is, how do we create the mechanisms that allow those choices to be made, right? And how do I frame those in a way that appeal to lawmakers and regulators and the insurance industry and the legal system? So for me, that's where I'm spending my time now. It's in these sort of defining the practices that make a difference so that they can be delivered primarily through the marketplace.
So backing up a minute, for the viewers and listeners that are maybe not familiar with blockchain, or they were super into it in 2017 and early 2018 before the big crash and bear market came, what is a blockchain? Let's take a quick step back and at Andy or Tony or Lorien, what is it?
The way I think about a blockchain is a lot of times I make a reference to something like PayPal. If I want to send you something on PayPal, I just send it, to your email address, and it sends through this central party, which is PayPal Inc. And hopefully they'll let you take out the money. So I'm talking about a payments use case here. But if PayPal decides to hold up the payment, they can do that. They can shut down your account. One way to think about a blockchain is, instead of having a single entity PayPal, what if we had a group of 100 people who all had to sort of come to consensus as sort of this group, and together everyone says, yes, this is a valid transaction, so therefore it goes through. There's no single person that could stop me from sending something to Will. That's one way to think of a blockchain in terms of this payment use case. But in general, the underlying principle is we're taking centralized architectures and decentralizing them, taking it from a single point of failure to sort of systems that come together on consensus, groups of entities sort of operating and sort of coming to a general consensus. That's the way I think about it, from sort of a public blockchain using this payments use case. Does that make sense?
It does. And Tony, I think at one point you gave me a Harry Potter reference or a Harry Potter analogy for what. Do you remember what that was?
Oh my gosh, no! But the one that I usually use to piggyback on what Andy was just saying was, if you think about it, like if you get into a bar and 2 people get in a fight, what's the first thing you generally do, right? Everyone looks for the guy, usually with the round glasses, with the greasy hair, usually the accountant, and everyone places bets on who's going to win. And the way it generally works, the way it generally worked then is that the guy would take all the money, right, and then whoever won, he'd dash some out and he'd take some in the middle. There's no other great way for all these people to really solve this problem of being able to place bets unless you had that bookie in the middle, right? That person you decide on, that person would take rent, extract rent from it as a transaction fee for doing the work. It's no different than in today's age, or maybe in the recent past. If everyone wanted to understand what the weather was like, if everyone had to flip on the TV or maybe get the newspaper, or everyone had to walk outside or call a service or something to try and figure out what the weather may be. How do you use technology to sort of start, reducing the cost of that? Obviously, I have a weather app now, but how do we sort of do that similarly with these more complex problems, which is really a contract between you and that bookie to say, you need to tell me who won, and we're all looking at it and we can all see it together to say who won, and then you just sort of pay out based on that. So in the the permission space, instead of it being a bunch of people in a bar, it's a bunch of companies in a business ecosystem who have to do something together that's rather complex. And so what we're doing is we're looking, at least the way I see it, is blockchain enables the technology to make that happen. It also enables the economics of making that happen in a new and different way. And it provides a governance structure to allow you to manage it all. And it combines these things in a new and innovative way that had never been seen before. And so every business that already has a business struggles with the new model. So one of the challenges associated with blockchain today is walking through the leaders of these business, people who hold the purse strings, and understanding what that looks like, the risk to their business, the benefit to their business. And it's just been a very slow evolution.
Yeah, I think I would add to those descriptions that it's a way of verifying the originality of information and therefore creating true digital scarcity of a piece of information or a digital good, which I think is either an outcome, a use case, or a basic definition of blockchain, depending on the way you come at it.
Right. And just to piggyback on that, because it's a beautiful way of saying, in some ways, in healthcare, is if there's a company that has a piece of information that can be useful to everyone, how do you land it, keep track of who has access to it, who benefits from it, and bring that value back to the originator? That's something that is really hard on the internet, because you can make a copy of stuff and send it everywhere. There's no great way for everyone to agree that this person owns this, they delivered it, it delivered value, and then we're going to reward them. That's very difficult in the standard way the internet's created today.
Yeah, and at a very, very, very basic level, the Harry Potter-esque analogy that I think you gave me at one point, Tony, was that you can imagine 10,000 parchments or little pieces of paper up in the air, and somebody writing on one of the pieces of paper, and then it just magically, that transaction or that writing magically gets copied to all the other pieces of paper, so that any one piece of paper has the exact copy of what's written or what's transacted on that ledger, and it's very distributed. A lot of people are defining Web3 different ways. Like I remember I started a coffee shop in Seattle around 2010, and I hosted a bunch of meetups with the semantic web folks. And
right.
So they have a claim to Web3, they say, and then other people are trying to loop in AI and XR into the whole. Mm-hmm. Is it fair to kind of loop into those things, or does it matter, or how are you thinking about just or are you specifically focused on the data ownership and privacy?
Yeah. I love that there's a lot of people vying for Web3, because it means that they want the internet to be better. And I think that's kind of what we all want. And I have to scope it down to even though it's very high level vision when I talk about, ownership of your data and right to privacy online. All these other things you're mentioning are super important too. And I think they can all fit together. And so, I'm not trying to push any specific definition of Web3, but that's what it means to me. And if I even resume out, it's to me, it's a re-decentralization of the internet, the way it used to be, or the way it was sort of originally envisioned. And so that's how I take it. But the things, to me, AI is sort of orthogonal, and VR and XR. I think that to me is like an iteration on the UI. But if I had to try to munge all that together, I'd start using words like metaverse.
I think a major piece of friction that you're talking about, Tony, is, and this word is all over the blockchain space. A major piece of friction is trust. And I think if we're talking about scalability or scaling something at a certain level, what blockchains are doing is are scaling trust. So if we think about DeFi right now, I can, let's say I could lend somebody in Fiji some amount of money with exactly the same trust assumptions with which I can lend my brother some money. So trust is traditionally a very small scale thing, because you have to know the people involved to a sufficient degree where you actually have a sense of what you kind of know what they're going to do, or you know what they're all about. So things when we start to grow our network and we start to grow the people we interact with such that we can't actually know all of them to that degree, then a lot of things that are possible within small groups stop becoming possible. Unless we are able to use a blockchain to do it, in which case, and with correct protocols, in which case that same type of trust that I can have with somebody in a small group can be extended to somebody across the world that I don't know at all. So I think scaling trust is a major component.
Yeah, that's good. It's a really interesting conversation because you often hear the word trustless, but what trustless is just scaling trust. It's placing the trust instead of in the small number of human beings. It's placing trust into the machines, into the cryptography, into the game theory mechanics that is going to trust that ledger with our machines and the programs that we've set up are going to be reliable. Is that how you would kind of think about the trustless versus scaling trust conversation, or is there something different there?
Yeah, like trustless, the word is just shorthand for everything you just said, and also placing trust that in the fact that the code was written correctly and there's no bugs and a bunch of other stuff.
Yeah.
It's like an extreme minimization of trust, not getting rid of it altogether.
And really what you're trusting in is the fact that people are going to act in their own self-interest. The way these networks work is that people use their dollars, their money, whatever is valuable to them. They buy hardware and mine, or they take US dollars and buy tokens and stake them. You're trusting that greed is consistent across humans and they will act in their best interest. And the Bitcoin blockchain has proven for 10 years that this is a trustworthy way to think about decentralizing systems.
Yeah. So the two things I'd like to chat about before we go here, and they're related, is what is Web3? Right? What is a Web3 product manager? And then two, where are we heading in blockchain and coming into 2021 here? So on the first point, if we think about Web 1, the putting information online via these different protocols, broadly speaking, right? Broadly speaking, Web 2 was the communication between human beings, the social aspect of the internet. How would you, Spencer? How would you frame Web 3? I remember in the early days there was the talk of the semantic web and the machines talking to each other. But how would you frame Web 3 from a paradigm shift perspective?
Well, just to be clear though, like my perspective on this, if it helps, is Web 1.0 is the encyclopedia online. Web 2.0 was like Wikipedia, and people being able to sort of curate and think and work together to solve problems using this technology and introduce communication. And social media fits in that category. And then so I think the question is like, what is that next iteration and how does crypto and blockchain change the internet to make a Web 3.0? I think that's another way. That's the way I would frame the question. That's helpful.
So following that then, Web 3 is people collaborating to create Wikipedia and also sharing in the costs of doing so and the benefits of doing so. And also sharing in control over Wikipedia. Rather than Wikipedia or like the Wikipedia organization kind of having the burden of responsibility over the website that they're managing. Wikipedia is like a great probably one of the best Web 2 examples of like approaching a Web 3 ethos, given that it's such a distributed community of contributors. But even at the infrastructure level, Wikipedia is based on servers that are controlled by individual companies. The Web 3 vision or the Web 3 ethos is that we can have all these great things that we have in Web 2, but instead of those being controlled and owned by corporations or individual companies or even individual people that have the power to change what's on those platforms and to control and make and control what's happening on their platforms and control what is being done for whatever reason they would like to. Web 3 is about putting individual users and putting communities back in control of what they're doing. So the Web3 stack has blockchain at its core. Blockchain is kind of the incentive mechanism, or the incentive layer, and the kind of the thing that ties everything together. But there's also compute and storage and search and lots of other things that are really important. So, for example, Filecoin just launched its mainnet, and Filecoin is a distributed storage protocol that creates incentives for people to store everybody else's files on their computer in a very distributed fashion. So basically, instead of loading your stuff and hosting it on AWS, you can now host it on IPFS, which is the Interplanetary File System, which is kind of what Filecoin is built on top of. And Filecoin is like the incentive mechanism that supports the sustainable use of IPFS. So you can host your own website on IPFS rather than on AWS. There's also the Graph, which is basically an indexing protocol, sort of like middleware, that allows front-end websites to easily index and search for and retrieve content that is on chain, within smart contracts, and also on IPFS or other distributed storage networks. And the Graph is transitioning to a decentralized architecture as well, where there'll be incentives for lots of people to host their own Graph nodes that will index the rest of Web3. And there'll also be incentives for people to curate which indices are going to be important, or which parts of Web3 are going to be important to index. So it's this whole kind of completely decentralized and distributed approach to all of the things that we've been doing in a very top-down, hierarchical, centralized way. And that is the Web3 vision.
All right, a couple quick things before you go. Number one, I have a general newsletter where I write about technology and startups and health science and teaching people to code. And I write about a variety of different subjects that we talk about on this show. So if you go to wclittle.com, there you'll be able to subscribe, and you'll also be able to subscribe to particular topics. If you're just interested in one or a few of them, you'll be notified right when I publish new content in those areas. Number two, my partners and I at Proto Ventures have a portfolio company called Startup Rocket. If you go to startuprocket.com, there you'll be able to receive coaching guides and customize an operations framework for you and your team and your advisors to be on the same page in terms of what is the appropriate next step for you and your entrepreneurial journey. And finally, if you wouldn't mind leaving a review anywhere that you have listened to this podcast or watched this podcast, it would be super helpful to help those who might be interested in consuming this content as well. Thank you.